They're getting closer.
Mommy!
I had to have you stay with me. Shh, it's okay. I'm here. Hold on tight. We have to go.
Before we begin today's story, welcome to Story of the Black Past, a place where we uncover powerful and forgotten stories from history. Stories of courage, resistance, and the moments when the oppressed turned the tables in ways no one expected. If you are new here, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time you are watching this video. We always love to see how far our stories travel. If you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe and like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to life. Thank you for being here. Now relax, avoid all distractions, and pay close attention. Watch until the very end, because the story you are about to hear is something you will not want to miss even for a moment. Tonight, we travel to the dense forests and winding rivers of Mississippi during the mid-19th century. A place where escape was not only dangerous, but nearly impossible for someone carrying more than just their own life. This is the story of a mother who refused to leave her child behind, and the men who believed they could hunt her down without resistance. They had no idea what awaited them. Her name was Naya. She worked on a plantation near a river that cut through thick forest. Like many others, her days were filled with labor and her nights with exhaustion. But unlike many, she carried something that made her situation even more dangerous. She had an infant, a child too young to walk, too young to understand silence, too young to move without sound, and in a place where even a single noise could bring danger, that made escape nearly impossible. But Naya had already made her decision. She would not leave her child behind, no matter the cost. For weeks, she prepared in silence. She observed the guards. She studied the patrol routes. She learned when the nights were darkest and when the sounds of the forest were loud enough to hide movement. And she waited. One night, when the air was thick and the sky held no moon, she moved, carefully, quietly, holding her child close. Every step was measured, every sound avoided. And by the time the plantation realized she was gone, she had already disappeared into the forest. The alarm spread quickly, and the response was immediate. Bounty hunters were called. Not ordinary men, but experienced trackers. Men who had spent years hunting runaways. Men who believed no one could outrun them, especially not a woman carrying a baby. They followed her trail easily at first. The marks were clear: footprints, broken plants, signs of movement through the forest, and something else: small disturbances, the kind that told them she was not alone. They moved faster, confident, certain, because to them this was already over. A woman with an infant could not move far, could not hide well, could not outlast them. But they did not understand Naya. She did not move like someone running. She moved like someone who had already accepted the risk. She chose her path carefully, staying near water when she could, walking on roots and stones to avoid leaving clear prints. And most importantly, she used the forest itself, the sounds, the shadows, the confusion of dense terrain. As the hunters moved deeper, something began to change. The trail became less clear. Signs appeared, then disappeared. At times it looked like she had turned back. At others, it seemed like she had vanished completely. The men slowed, watching, listening, trying to understand what was happening. But what they did not realize was this: they were no longer following her. They were being led. Because Naya had done something they never expected. She had turned her greatest weakness into her greatest strength: the child. Instead of trying to silence the baby completely, she timed her movement with the sounds of the forest. When insects grew loud, when wind moved through the trees, when distant animals cried out, she moved. And when the forest fell quiet, she stopped. Still, silent, invisible. The child's presence, which they believed would betray her, became something she controlled, something she used. Hours passed, then more. The hunters continued, but their confidence began to shift, because nothing was certain anymore. The trail did not behave as expected. The signs did not lead clearly. And the deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to close around them. But they kept going, because they believed they were close. They believed she was getting weaker. They believed it was only a matter of time. They were wrong, because while they chased what they thought was her path, Naya had already changed direction. Quietly, carefully, without leaving a trace they could trust. And what awaited them was not what they expected. Not a capture, not a confrontation, but something far worse. The realization that they had lost her completely. And by the time they understood it, it was already too late. The forest in Mississippi grew thicker the deeper the bounty hunters moved. What had once been a clear pursuit slowly turned into something uncertain. The men began to notice it in small ways first. The ground no longer held clear prints. Branches were disturbed in ways that did not point in a single direction. And the sounds around them felt different. Heavier, closer, as if the forest itself was watching. They stopped more often now, listening, looking at one another, trying to make sense of what was happening. Because this was no longer a simple chase. This was something else. One of the men knelt to examine the ground where he believed he saw a footprint. But when he looked closer, it was gone. Just soil. Undisturbed, another man pointed toward broken leaves ahead. They moved in that direction. But after a few steps, the signs disappeared again. Nothing connected. Nothing made sense. Frustration began to rise. Voices grew sharper. Movements less certain. Because they had followed every rule they knew. And still they were losing the trail. Meanwhile, far ahead of them, Naya moved with quiet precision. Her child rested against her chest, wrapped carefully, shielded from the cold in the night air. She did not rush. She did not panic. Because she understood something the men did not. The forest was not just a place. It was a tool. She had grown up near land like this. She knew how sound traveled, how water could hide movement, how shadows could break shapes, and she used all of it. Every step she took was chosen. Every pause was intentional. When the child stirred, she did not fight it. She waited. Let the sounds of the forest rise around them, and moved only when those sounds could carry the noise away. Back in the forest behind her, the men pressed forward. But now, something else had entered the chase. Doubt. They began to question the direction, to question the signs, to question each other. Because what they were following no longer felt real. It felt constructed, like something placed in front of them. And in truth, it was. Naya had begun creating false paths, subtle ones, paths that looked natural, but led in circles, paths that pulled the hunters deeper into areas where the terrain slowed them, where visibility dropped, where movement became difficult. And they followed, because they trusted what they saw, even when it led them nowhere. Hours turned into longer hours. Fatigue set in. The air grew heavier, and still they found nothing. No clear direction, no clear sign, no woman, no child. Only the feeling that they were no longer in control. One of the men stopped walking. He looked around slowly, listening, and for the first time he said it out loud. They were lost, not just without a trail, but without direction. The others did not respond immediately, because they already knew. The realization settled over them, quietly, heavy. The woman they had chased, the one they believed would be the easiest to catch, had done something they never expected. She had taken control of the chase. She had turned their experience against them. and she had disappeared. Completely. Far ahead, beyond where their voices could ever reach, Naya stepped out of the densest part of the forest. The air felt different, lighter, more open. She paused for a moment, not out of fear, but out of awareness, listening, waiting. There was nothing behind her. No movement, no pursuit, only silence. For the first time since she left the plantation, she allowed herself to breathe differently. Not in relief, but in understanding. She had done it. Not by outrunning them, not by fighting them, but by thinking beyond them. By using what they believed would slow her down. Her child, her surroundings, her silence, and turning it into strength. Back in the forest, the bounty hunters began their slow return. Empty-handed, confused, and carrying something they were not used to carrying. Failure. They would never speak of it the same way. They would never fully explain it, because there was no clear answer. Only a quiet truth, that the woman they chased had outthought them. And by the time they understood it, she was already beyond their reach. Forever. The men walked back through the forest in Mississippi with heavy steps. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. The same paths they had entered with confidence now felt unfamiliar, almost hostile. Every sound made them pause. Every shadow made them look twice, because something had changed. Not the forest, but their understanding of it. They had entered believing they controlled the hunt. They were leaving knowing they had lost it. One of the men stopped briefly and looked back, as if expecting to see something. A movement. A sign. But there was nothing. Only trees. Still, silent, unchanged. And that silence carried weight, because it reminded them of what had happened. They had followed, trusted, moved forward with certainty, and still they had been led away, step by step, until there was nothing left to follow. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, exhaustion had replaced anger, and confusion had replaced confidence. They returned with empty hands, no explanation, no answers, only a story they could not fully understand. Back on the plantation, the news spread quickly. The bounty hunters had failed. The woman and her child were gone, and no one knew where. Among the enslaved people, the story moved differently, quietly, in glances, in silence, in understanding. A mother had escaped, with her child, against men who were trained to hunt, and she had not been caught. That alone carried meaning, because it showed something that many had only hoped for, that even in a system built to control every movement, there were still ways to move beyond it. Naya continued forward, the forest behind her, the unknown ahead. She did not rush, because she understood something important. Escape is not a single moment. It is a process, a series of decisions, each one carrying risk, each one requiring awareness. Her child stirred again. This time she did not immediately move. She waited, listened, let the world around her settle, then adjusted her hold and continued. Step by step, always aware, always present. Days passed. The distance grew, and with that distance came something new. Not safety, not yet, but space. Space to think, space to breathe, space to exist without immediate pursuit. And that space mattered, because it allowed something else to grow. Possibility. Back in the place she had left behind, life continued. The fields, the work, the control, but something had shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but deeply, because a story now existed. A story that could not be erased. A story of a mother who refused to leave her child, who refused to be limited by what others believed, and who turned what was seen as weakness into strength. That story moved quietly, from one person to another, not in full detail, but in meaning, in understanding, that it was possible. Naya's path continued beyond the reach of those who had chased her. Where she went, no one could say for certain. But one thing remained clear. She was never captured, and neither was her child. And that truth carried weight far beyond the moment, because the men who chased her expected something simple. A woman slowed down, a child giving away her position, an easy capture. But what awaited them was something entirely different. A mind that understood them, a patience they did not expect, and a path they could not follow. As this story moves toward its final reflection, one thing becomes clear. The chase was never equal. Because while they relied on strength and experience, she relied on understanding. And in the end, understanding is what changed everything. She did not outrun them. She outthought them. And once she did, the outcome was already decided. And by the time they realized it, it was already too late. And even as the story begins to settle, there is still one final truth that remains. Because what happened in the forests of Mississippi was not just an escape. It was a reversal. A quiet but powerful reversal of control. For so long, the direction had always been the same. The hunters pursued. The enslaved ran. The outcome was expected. But in this moment, that direction changed. Naya did not simply run. She guided. She redirected. She turned the hunt into something else entirely. And once that shift happened, everything that followed was no longer in the hands of the men who believed they controlled it. That is what they never expected. Not the distance, not the endurance, but the change in direction. Because once direction is lost, the rest follows. And they lost it completely. The deeper meaning of this story is not only in what she did, but in how she did it. She understood her situation. She understood her environment. And she understood the people who were coming after her. That understanding became her advantage. Not strength, not numbers, but clarity. And clarity, when used at the right moment, becomes something powerful. The bounty hunters could not adjust, because they were not prepared to think differently. They followed patterns, trusted signs, believed in what had worked before, but what had worked before no longer applied. Because Naya had stepped outside of it. That is where her victory truly lies. Not in the escape itself, but in the shift she created. A shift that changed the outcome before it was even fully visible. As this story reaches its final reflection, there is nothing more to unfold. Only something to carry with you. That what seems like a disadvantage can become strength. That what seems like a limitation can become direction. And that what is underestimated can become unstoppable. Naya carried her child. Something the hunters believed would slow her down. But instead, it sharpened her awareness. It made her move with precision. It made her think beyond herself. And that changed everything. The men returned with nothing. The forest kept its silence. And the story remained. Not as noise, not as spectacle, but as truth. A quiet truth. That sometimes the greatest power is not force. It is understanding. And once understanding is used, the outcome is already decided. And by the time others realize it, it is already too late. That is where the story rests. And that is why it continues. Not in the past, but in that truth. A truth that remains. Waiting for the next moment, for the next person, for the next time someone sees what others do not, and chooses to act. And when that moment comes, just as it did here, everything will change. And there will be nothing left to chase. Only the realization that freedom has already moved beyond reach, and that it is already too late. And even now, after every part of this story has been told, there is still something that remains. Not in the forest, not in the men who failed, but in the understanding that was left behind. Because what Naya did was not only escape, she revealed something quiet, but powerful. That control depends on expectation, on knowing how someone will move, where they will go, what they will do. And the moment that expectation is broken, control begins to fade. That is what happened in Mississippi. Not just a chase that failed, but a certainty that was lost. The bounty hunters were not unskilled. They were experienced. They knew the land. They knew the signs. They knew how to follow, but they depended on patterns. And those patterns became their weakness, because Naya had already seen them, understood them, and chosen not to follow them. That is the turning point. Not when she left, but when she understood. Because understanding changes everything. It creates options. It creates direction. And once those exist, the outcome is no longer fixed. That is why her story carries weight beyond the moment itself. It shows that even in a system designed to control every movement, there is still something that cannot be fully controlled. The human mind. The ability to observe, to learn, to adapt, and to act. Naya used all of that. And in doing so, she turned what was seen as her greatest weakness into her greatest strength. She carried her child. And instead of being slowed, she became more precise, more aware, more intentional. That changed the entire nature of the chase. The men followed signs. She created them. The men trusted patterns. She broke them. The men believed they were in control. She took that control away. And once she did, everything that followed was inevitable. As this story reaches its final breath, there is nothing more to add, only something to remember. That what seems impossible is often only unseen. That what seems certain is often only unchallenged. And that what seems powerful is often only unquestioned. Naya questioned it. She saw beyond it. She acted on it. And once she did, everything changed. The chase ended. The trail disappeared. And the outcome was already decided. That is where this story remains. Not in the past, but in that truth. A truth that continues quietly, waiting for the moment it will be seen again. And when it is, just like before, everything will change. And there will be nothing left to follow. Only the realization that it is already too late. And even as everything comes to its final stillness, there is one last thing that remains. Not a scene, not a memory, but a truth that continues to move quietly beneath the surface. Because stories like this are not only meant to be heard, they are meant to be understood. Naya's story becomes that understanding. A quiet reminder that what appears to be strength is not always what wins. And what appears to be weakness is not always what loses. In Mississippi, the system around her was built on control, on watching, on tracking, on predicting. But none of those things accounted for one simple reality, that a person who understands the system can move beyond it. That is what Naya did. She did not try to overpower the men who chased her. She did not try to outrun them in a straight line. She changed the nature of the chase itself. And once she did, the outcome was no longer theirs to decide. That is the deeper meaning behind everything that happened. Not just that she escaped, but that she removed their advantage. Because once advantage is removed, even strength begins to lose its power. The bounty hunters had experience. They had numbers. They had confidence. But they relied on patterns. And those patterns were broken. Quietly, carefully, completely. That is what made the difference. As this story reaches its final reflection, there is nothing more to unfold. Only something to carry forward. That sometimes the greatest change begins with understanding, with seeing something clearly, with recognizing what others overlook, and choosing to act differently. Naya did that. And in doing so, she created something that could not be undone. Not just distance, not just escape, but a shift in how power moved, a shift in how control could be challenged, and a shift in what was believed to be possible. That shift remains, not in the forest, not in the past, but in the idea, an idea that continues quietly, that even in the most controlled situations, there is always a way that may not be obvious, a way that may not be expected, but a way that exists for those who can see it. Naya saw it. She followed it. And once she did, everything changed. The men returned with nothing. The trail was gone, and the mother and her child moved beyond reach. Forever. That is where this story rests, and that is why it never truly ends. Because the truth it carries remains, waiting for the next moment, for the next person, for the next time someone sees what others do not and chooses to act. And when that moment comes, just like before, everything will change, and there will be nothing left to chase. Only the realization that freedom has already passed beyond reach, and that it is already too late. And even now, as the final words settle, there is still something that continues to echo quietly, not in sound, but in thought. Because what this story leaves behind is not just an ending. It is a way of seeing, a way of understanding how things work beneath the surface. Naya did not change the world around her in a loud or visible way. She changed her position within it, and that made all the difference. In Mississippi, the system remained for a time. The land remained. The people remained. But something had already shifted. Because once one outcome breaks expectation, it opens a space where new outcomes can exist, even if they are not immediately seen, even if they are not immediately repeated. That space matters. Because it changes how people think, it changes what they believe is possible. And once belief changes, everything connected to it begins to move. That is the quiet power of this story. It does not rely on noise, and it does not depend on recognition. It exists in understanding, in the realization that control is never complete, that systems are never without gaps, and that those gaps can be used, if they are seen clearly enough. Naya saw them. She moved through them. And once she did, the outcome was already beyond the reach of those who chased her. That is why the story does not need more. Because everything that matters has already happened. The shift, the decision, the result. What remains is the meaning. And that meaning continues, not in one place, not in one time, but wherever the same conditions exist. Because the truth does not change. That awareness creates possibility. That understanding creates direction. And that once a person steps outside of expectation, the path opens in ways others cannot follow. Naya stepped outside. And once she did, there was no way to bring her back. That is the final truth. And that is why this story remains. Not as something distant, but as something real. Something that explains how change begins. Quietly, carefully, and completely. And once it begins, there is nothing left to stop it. Only the realization that it has already happened. And that it is already too late. That is the end. And that is why it continues. And even now, at the very edge of this story, there is still one last truth that refuses to fade. Because what Naya left behind was not just distance. It was direction. A direction that did not follow the rules that had been set for her. A direction that could not be tracked, predicted, or controlled. And that is what changed everything. In Mississippi, the system depended on something simple. That those who tried to escape would move in ways that could be followed. That they would leave signs. That they would react in fear. That they would be predictable. Naya was none of those things. And because she was not, the system lost its hold on her. That is the part that matters most. Not the distance she created, but the expectation she broke. Because once expectation breaks, control weakens. And once control weakens, the outcome begins to change. The bounty hunters could not recover from that, because they were not chasing a person anymore. They were chasing an idea they could not understand. An idea that moved outside of their experience, outside of their patterns, outside of their control. And by the time they realized it, the truth was already clear. The chase had ended long before they stopped walking. That is the quiet power of awareness. It works ahead of action. It shapes outcomes before they are visible. And once it is used correctly, it cannot be undone. Naya used it fully. Not loudly, not dramatically, but effectively. And that was enough. Enough to disappear. Enough to survive. Enough to move beyond everything that was meant to hold her back. As this story finally comes to rest, there is nothing more to add, only something to carry. That sometimes the greatest strength is not what can be seen, it is what can be understood. That sometimes the greatest victory is not in fighting, it is in thinking differently. And that sometimes the moment everything changes is the moment no one else notices. Naya reached that moment. She stepped into it. And once she did, everything followed. The men returned with nothing. The forest kept its silence. And the story remained. Not as noise, not as legend, but as truth. A quiet truth. That once a person sees beyond the limits placed before them, those limits begin to disappear. And once they act on that understanding, there is no going back. That is where the story ends. And that is why it never truly ends. Because the truth it carries remains. Waiting. For the next moment it will be seen again. And when it is, just like before, everything will change. And there will be nothing left to chase. Only the realization that it is already too late. And even now, after every word has been spoken, there is still one final layer that remains. Because this story was never only about escape. It was about awareness reaching its full form. The moment when everything becomes clear. The moment when fear is replaced by understanding. And the moment when action follows without hesitation. Naya reached that point. And once she did, nothing around her could remain the same. In Mississippi, the system continued for a time. The land did not change. The structures remained. But something inside it had already shifted. Because once a single person breaks the expected outcome, it introduces something new. Possibility. And possibility is powerful. Because it does not stay in one place. It moves. Quietly. Through thought. Through memory. Through the understanding that something different can happen. That is what Naya left behind. Not just a story, but a possibility. The men who chased her carried it, even if they never spoke of it, even if they tried to ignore it. Because they had seen something they could not explain. That experience changes a person. It creates hesitation. It creates doubt. And doubt is something systems built on certainty cannot easily survive. That is how change begins. Not always in large moments, but in small, quiet shifts. Moments where something no longer works the way it once did. Naya created that shift. Not by force, but by clarity. By understanding how everything around her worked. And choosing to move differently within it. That is what made the difference. As this story reaches its final breath, there is nothing more to unfold. Only something to hold on to. That what seems fixed is not always fixed. That what seems powerful is not always permanent. And that what seems impossible is often only unseen. Naya saw it. She acted on it. And once she did, everything changed. The chase ended. The trail vanished. And the outcome was already decided. That is where this story remains. Not in the past, but in that truth. A truth that continues quietly, waiting for the moment it will be seen again. And when it is, just like before, everything will change, and there will be nothing left to follow. Only the realization that it is already too late. That is the end. And that is why it continues. And even now, as the story reaches its final stillness, there is one last truth that remains. Not spoken, not written, but understood. Because what Naya revealed was never just about escape in Mississippi. It was about the nature of power itself, how it operates, how it depends on control, and how that control is built on something more fragile than it appears. Expectation. The belief that people will act in certain ways, that they will follow certain paths, that they will move within limits that can be predicted. Naya stepped outside of that. And once she did, everything began to change. Because when expectation breaks, control weakens. And when control weakens, the outcome is no longer certain. That is what the bounty hunters faced. Not just a woman escaping, but a situation they could not understand. They followed what they knew, but what they knew no longer applied. And by the time they realized it, the truth had already taken shape. The chase was over, even though they were still walking. That is the quiet power of awareness. It moves ahead of action. It shapes the result before it becomes visible. And once it is in motion, it cannot be reversed. Naya used that power, fully, carefully, without hesitation. And in doing so, she created something that could not be undone. Not just distance, not just survival, but a shift in how control could be challenged, a shift in how possibility could be seen, and a shift in what was believed to be unchangeable. As this story finally comes to rest, there is nothing more to add, only something to carry. That the greatest strength is not always force, it is understanding. That the greatest movement is not always seen, it is felt. And that the greatest change often begins in silence. Naya moved in silence. She acted with understanding. And once she did, everything followed. The men returned with nothing. The forest kept its secret. And the story remained. Not as noise, not as legend, but as truth. A quiet truth. That once a person sees beyond the limits placed before them, those limits begin to fall away. And once they act on that understanding, there is no going back. That is where this story ends. And that is why it never truly ends. Because the truth it carries remains, waiting. For the next moment it will be seen again. And when it is, just like before, everything will change. And there will be nothing left to chase. Only the realization that it is already too late.